When I saw my husband stop the car in front of the old, abandoned house, my breath caught in my throat, not from the bump of the sudden halt, but because I knew this was the place. The place where everything changed, where a single choice rewrote the map of my life. His hand gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles had turned pale, and I could see the vein on his temple pulsing. He didn't say a word, just stared at the house with a stillness that felt louder than any argument we'd ever had. I followed his gaze, and the windows seemed to stare back at me like hollow eyes, exposing everything I'd tried to bury. My fingers curled into the fabric of my coat, a useless attempt to ground myself in the present moment, but my mind betrayed me, dragging me back to the days and moments that led us here. Days filled with soil under my nails, long afternoons, and quiet choices that didn't feel like choices at all. I thought of the first time I stepped into this house, how different it felt then, and how innocent the first believed myself to be. His silence was unbearable. It told me he knew. Maybe not the whole truth. Maybe not the worst part. But enough. Enough to dismantle the safe, ordinary life we'd built, brick by brick. He glanced at me then, just once, and in his eyes I saw every question I'd been too afraid to ask myself. My heart pounded so hard I could hear it in my ears. I wanted to tell him everything, to explain what happened and how it all spiraled, but the words caught in my throat. Instead, I'll tell you. I'll tell you the truth as it really happened, not the version whispered by gossip or imagined in hurried judgments. Because 3 months ago, I made a mistake, a single moment that has been unfolding ever since, and now, here I am, trying to piece together the story before it all comes apart. But before I confess, tell me in the comments, have you ever held a secret so tightly, believing it would stay hidden forever, only to watch it slip through your fingers anyway? When we moved into the house, I told myself it was the fresh start we needed. The walls smelled of new paint, the floors creaked in ways that felt unfamiliar, and the garden was nothing more than tangled weeds and overgrown hedges. I wanted to believe that this would change everything, the late-night silences with my husband, the way we passed each other like polite strangers in our own kitchen, the subtle ache that came from feeling invisible in the life I'd built. But the truth is, you can't pack up and move away from what's missing. It follows you, like a shadow in the trunk of the car. The first weeks were filled with boxes, endless unpacking, and small arguments about where things should go. My husband buried himself in work almost immediately, his briefcase unpacked before his clothes, his laptop open on the dining table while I tried to make the house feel like a home. He wasn't cruel. He wasn't careless. He was just distant. His life had a rhythm I no longer seemed to fit into, and I couldn't decide if I'd fallen out of step or if he'd stopped hearing the music altogether. One morning, while struggling to drag a cracked planter across the yard, I noticed the man next door. He was trimming his hedge, the sound of the shears sharp and steady. He looked up, waved, and crossed the property line with an ease that felt both intrusive and comforting. "Do you need a hand?" he asked, his voice casual, the kind neighbors use when they're trying to be friendly without prying. I almost said no, but the planter slipped from my grip, landing hard on the soil, and that decided it for me. He helped me lift it into place as if it weighed nothing. It should have been nothing, a neighborly gesture, a polite thank you, but I felt something shift in that moment. Maybe it was the way he looked directly at me, as though seeing me wasn't a habit but a choice. Maybe it was simply that I'd been so used to the absence of that feeling that its sudden return startled me. He talked about the garden, how he'd been tending his for years, how he could help clear the wild mess of mine. He spoke with an ease that felt like sunlight through a window you'd forgotten could open. Later that day, my husband called from the office. He asked about the movers, about a delivery, about bills. His voice was clipped, distracted, as if he were already halfway to his next meeting. I told him everything was fine. It was easier than saying, "I feel like I don't exist to you anymore." I hung up and looked out the window, saw the neighbor bending to gather the trimmings from his hedge, and felt a quiet warmth in my chest that I couldn't name. The days unfolded in small, forgettable moments, sorting silverware, folding towels, labeling boxes to go in the attic. But every time I stepped into the garden, I saw the promise of what it could become. He offered to lend me his tools, said he could show me how to prune the roses that had been choked by weeds. I accepted, telling myself it was practical, just gardening help, nothing more. But practicality has a way of blurring into something else when you're lonely. That night, lying beside my husband, I listened to the sound of him breathing, steady and heavy, as sleep pulled him under. I stared at the ceiling and thought of the garden, of the way my hands had felt raw from pulling weeds, of the neighbors' easy laughter when I cursed at a stubborn root that refused to budge. I felt guilty for thinking about him, but guilt was faint and fleeting. Mostly, I felt awake. By the end of the first week, he'd already fixed the broken gate latch without being asked. He left a bag of potting soil by the back door with a note, "This should help with the hydrangeas." Small gestures, easy to dismiss. And yet, they landed in a part of me that hadn't felt touched in a long time. I told myself these were harmless things, thank yous, neighborly kindness. But even then, even in those early days, there was a pull. A thread that had begun to weave itself between his world and mine. I didn't tug on it, not yet. But I didn't cut it either. The rain came suddenly, the kind of rain that feels heavier than it should, turning the air sharp and damp. I'd been outside, kneeling in the garden, sleeves rolled up, trying to coax life out of the wild patch of earth by the back fence. The first fat drops hit the soil, darkening it in uneven patches, and before I could stand, the sky had opened fully. I scrambled to gather the tools, my hands slipping on the wet handles of the trowel and rake, when I saw him coming through the gate, already carrying 2 of my clay pots under his arm. "Storm caught you too," he said lightly, his voice raised over the downpour. I only nodded, trying to shield my face with one arm while I clutched a watering can in the other. We ended up moving in awkward synchrony, ferrying everything into the small, cluttered shed at the back of the garden. The air inside was damp, heavy with the smell of earth and wood, and the space was so tight that every movement seemed to press us closer. I told myself not to notice how his jacket brushed against my sleeve, or how the damp fabric of my shirt clung to my skin in a way that felt suddenly too revealing. But my mind betrayed me, cataloging each small moment, his hands reaching past mine to set a bag of soil on the shelf, the way a strand of wet hair fell onto his forehead, how his breath misted slightly in the cool air. The rain drummed hard on the tin roof, a sound so loud it swallowed conversation, and for a moment we just stood there, waiting, caught between leaving and staying. He leaned back against the wooden wall, arms crossed loosely, and for the first time, I looked at him properly. Not the quick glances over the fence or polite smiles in passing. But really looked. There was an ease to him, the kind of ease that doesn't demand anything. "Your garden has good bones," he said eventually, almost casually. "It just needs some work." His words were harmless, the tone neighborly, but I felt something inside me respond to the attention in them. I nodded, murmuring some half-formed response about roses and weeds, but my voice sounded strange to my own ears. I shifted to reach a shelf above me, trying to move a stack of old clay trays, but one slipped, knocking against my shoulder. He caught it before it hit the ground, his hand brushing mine in the process. It wasn't much. Barely a touch. But it left a trace that lingered longer than it should have. I tried to move back, but there wasn't enough space, and my heel knocked against a crate. I stumbled, just slightly, and his arm shot out instinctively, steadying me. For a moment, his hand was firm on my arm, and our eyes met, close enough that I could see the faint flecks of green around his pupils, the lines at the corners of his eyes that deepened when he smiled. We both stood frozen in that strange, fragile stillness. And then, almost before I could think, we kissed. It was quick, almost clumsy, like a word spoken out of turn. The kind of kiss that happens before you even register what it means. I pulled back immediately, the shed's walls suddenly feeling too close, the air too thick. I started, but the words didn't come. He didn't say anything either. He just shifted back slightly, giving me space, his expression unreadable. The rain outside softened, as if aware of what had just happened, the pounding on the roof turning into a light, steady patter. I busied myself with stacking the remaining tools, though my hands trembled just enough to betray me. When the rain slowed, I stepped out first, the cool air hitting my face like a reminder of reality. The garden looked washed, the colors sharper, the soil darker. He followed behind, carrying the last of the pots, setting them down without comment. We didn't speak about it. We didn't speak about anything that mattered. Just small words about the weather, the garden, the rain. But every word seemed to land in a space charged with something we weren't naming. Later, after he'd gone, I stood at the window, staring at the muddy footprints leading from the shed to the gate, each one a small reminder. I tried to tell myself it had been a mistake, an impulse born of too much closeness in too small a space. I tried to believe that forgetting it would be simple. But as I dried my hair with a towel, I could still feel the ghost of that kiss, faint as it was. And that night, when my husband called from his hotel room, his voice distant and full of logistics, flight delays, meetings, reminders, I found myself holding the phone a little tighter, as if pressing it closer could bridge the growing distance between us. I said nothing about the shed, the rain, or the moment that shouldn't have happened. I told him the garden was coming along fine. I said the rain had been heavy, but nothing had been damaged. My voice was steady. Too steady. But when I hung up, I stood there in the kitchen for a long time, staring at the dark window, my reflection looking back at me, and I knew I'd started something I couldn't quite name and maybe couldn't stop. I woke up the next morning hoping that sleep would have dulled the sharp edges of the previous day, but it hadn't. If anything, the memory of that brief, accidental kiss felt sharper in daylight, as though the sun had traced its outline and made it impossible to ignore. I moved through the morning rituals on autopilot, coffee, dishes, a half-hearted attempt at unpacking another box, yet every small, ordinary act was interrupted by the same thought: it happened. I stood by the kitchen sink, watching a bird pick at the damp earth outside, and wondered if forgetting was even an option. Could something so fleeting just disappear? Or would it linger in corners of my mind, like a stain no amount of scrubbing could remove? When the phone rang, I nearly jumped. My husband's name lit up the screen, and for a split second, I considered letting it go to voicemail. But I answered, forcing cheer into my voice, as though brightness could erase what I was hiding. He spoke about the hotel breakfast, about a meeting that had gone longer than expected, about the weather in the city. I added the occasional and oh really, in the right places, but all I could think was how easy it felt to keep this small, fragile secret. Too easy. After we hung up, I caught my reflection in the kitchen window. My hair was pulled back, damp from the shower, and there was nothing remarkable about the face staring back at me. Yet I didn't recognize it completely. I wondered if that was what guilt looked like, a barely perceptible shift, something only you could see. By mid-morning, I decided to work in the garden again. The rain had loosened the soil, and it seemed like the right thing to do, something that could tether me back to normalcy. I wore gloves this time, pulled my hat low over my forehead, and hoped the day would pass quietly. But of course, it didn't. I heard his footsteps on the gravel before I saw him. He didn't come through the gate right away, just lingered on his side of the fence, one hand resting on the top slat. "You missed a patch there," he said, pointing with the handle of a rake he was holding. I turned, forcing a smile that felt thin. "I'll get to it." He nodded, his gaze steady but not invasive, and then he stepped through the gate, carrying a bucket filled with small tools. "Thought you might need these." The normalcy of his words contrasted so sharply with the weight of what had happened that it almost made me dizzy. I wanted to ask if we were going to talk about it. I wanted to demand if it meant anything to him, or if it was already fading from his mind. But I said none of that. Instead, I nodded and took the bucket. We worked in silence for a while. He trimmed branches from the rosebush, and I pulled weeds along the fence. The air smelled of damp earth and cut stems, and the quiet between us wasn't exactly comfortable, but it wasn't hostile either. At one point, he set down the shears and crouched beside me, reaching to pull up a stubborn root I'd been struggling with. His arm brushed mine lightly, unintentionally, but it sent a tiny current through me. "I'll get it," he said, his voice low but calm. "Thanks," I muttered, not looking at him, focusing instead on the way the root finally gave way under his strength. I thought maybe we were managing, carving a path back to normal, pretending that the kiss had been nothing more than a clumsy mistake. But then he glanced up at me, and for half a second, our eyes met. There was nothing obvious in his expression, no smirk, no apology, but there was an acknowledgement. A silent, unspoken truth that we both recognized but refused to name. The rest of the day moved in strange fragments. I went inside, made tea, cleaned the counter that didn't need cleaning. He left the tools by the shed and disappeared back to his own garden. And yet, even after he was gone, I could still feel the echo of his presence, the scrape of his boots on gravel, the smell of earth clinging to his gloves, the weight of that fleeting glance. That night, my husband called again. His voice was warmer this time, less hurried. He told me he'd be home by the end of the week, maybe sooner. I said I was glad. And I was, at least I thought I was. But underneath that feeling was something I didn't want to name. Something that felt a lot like relief at his absence and dread at his return. After the call, I sat at the table, staring at my hands. The dirt under my nails, the faint scratches on my wrists from rose thorns, they all told a story of the day. But none of them told the truth. I thought of the kiss again. I told myself, firmly this time, that it had been nothing. A product of rain and closeness, of slipping feet and startled reflexes. But even as I tried to seal it into that box, I knew the lid wouldn't stay shut. Because it wasn't just about the kiss. It was about everything that had been missing for so long. In the silence of that evening, I realized something that unsettled me more than anything else. I wasn't thinking about how to stop this from happening again. I was wondering what would happen if it did. The next few days unfolded like a series of half-finished thoughts. I woke up each morning expecting to feel settled, expecting to have drawn a clear line in my head about what happened and what it meant. But instead, the memory of that kiss kept sliding into moments when I least expected it, while I poured my coffee, while I folded laundry, while I brushed my teeth at night. It wasn't constant, not exactly, but it was insistent, like a drip from a faucet you can't quite fix. I told myself over and over that I had no reason to feel this unsettled. People do careless things all the time. They cross boundaries, then step back over them. They tell themselves it's nothing and go on with their lives. That's what I wanted to do, go on. But it was like trying to walk with a stone in my shoe, you can keep moving, but you feel every step. On the third morning, the sky was clear, pale blue, the ground still damp from earlier rain. I took that as a sign that maybe I could start fresh. I grabbed my basket and went to the local market. I wanted to buy fresh vegetables, bread, maybe flowers for the kitchen table. Ordinary things, grounding things. The drive into town felt longer than it should have, like the road itself was stretching. The market was full of noise, vendors calling out prices, children weaving between stalls, the smell of fruit and warm bread mingling in the air. I lingered over tomatoes, feeling their weight in my hand, thinking of dinner I might make when my husband returned. But even as I made small, practical choices, carrots, lettuce, a loaf of crusty bread, my thoughts kept looping back. When I got back, I saw him in his driveway, loading tools into the back of his truck. He wasn't looking at me, not at first. But when he did, the moment stretched. Just a glance, a simple acknowledgement, but it carried the weight of what we hadn't said. I unloaded the groceries, trying to keep my movements steady. I thought about waving, just a small gesture to break the tension, but my hand stayed at my side. He gave a short nod before turning back to his truck. That should have been enough, a neighborly exchange, clean and harmless. But the knot in my stomach tightened instead of loosening. Later, he came by, carrying a bag of soil and a few garden stakes. He left them by the gate, not even stepping all the way into the yard this time. "You might need these," he said. His voice was casual, but there was something in the way he didn't quite meet my eyes. I thanked him, just as casually. But after he walked away, I stood there longer than necessary, looking at the stakes, the soil, the empty path where he'd been. That evening, my husband called again, his voice crackling slightly over the line. He asked if I was keeping busy, if I'd met any of the neighbors. I said yes, of course. I told him about the market, about the garden. I didn't tell him about the way my chest tightened every time I saw the man next door. I sat on the porch after the call, the sky deepening into dusk. The air smelled faintly of cut grass, and a breeze moved through the trees, making the leaves shiver. I wanted to feel calm, to let the quiet wash over me. But all I felt was the thrum of something I couldn't name. The next day, I decided to work on the fence. The latch was loose, the wood weathered. It felt like the kind of task that would demand focus. I found my gloves, my hammer, the jar of screws, and set to work. Not long after, he appeared again, leaning lightly against the fence post on his side. "Need help?" he asked. I hesitated before answering, aware of how loaded even that small question felt. "I think I've got it," I said, though the screw I was driving in slipped sideways. He stepped through the gate anyway, not intrusively, but with the easy confidence of someone who believed his presence wouldn't be unwelcome. He held out his hand for the hammer. I handed it over before I even thought about it. We worked together in silence, his hand steady, mine fumbling slightly. Every so often, our fingers brushed when he passed me a nail or I reached for the handle. Each brush felt like a spark, even though I tried to pretend it didn't. At one point, he bent to pick up a screw I'd dropped, and when he stood, we were too close. Not in a deliberate way, not even in a way anyone else might notice. But I noticed. The air between us felt like a held breath. He stepped back first, a small, deliberate movement, like he was giving me space. But the distance he created didn't erase the closeness I'd felt in that instant. By the time the latch was fixed, the sun was high, the wood warm under my palm. He handed me the hammer, our fingers barely touching, and for a second, we both paused. "Thanks," I said, my voice quieter than I meant. "Anytime," he replied, just as quiet. He left after that, and I stood there, staring at the newly fastened latch. It worked perfectly now, the gate swinging shut with a clean, solid click. But I felt no sense of closure. If anything, I felt the opposite. That night, I sat at the table with a notebook, pretending to make a list of things for the house. Paint colors, curtain measurements, repairs that still needed doing. But the pen kept hovering, the words wouldn't come. Instead, I kept replaying the day, every glance, every almost touch, every silence that said more than words could. I told myself, again, that I hadn't crossed any lines. Not really. But the truth pressed against me, insistent and undeniable. The line was already blurred, and I wasn't sure if I wanted to redraw it. By the fifth morning, I thought I had learned how to keep my thoughts in order, but all it took was the sight of him walking up the path with something in his hands to remind me that order was an illusion. He was holding a book, a worn, soft-backed gardening guide, the kind with faded pictures of flowers on the cover. I was in the kitchen, rinsing cups, when his shadow moved across the window. I dried my hands and stepped outside before he could knock. He held the book out like an offering. "I thought you might like this," he said, his voice light, almost casual. I looked at the cover. It smelled faintly of soil and old paper, the way books left in sheds or garages do. Something about that smell made me think of rainy days from my childhood, afternoons spent reading by windows while the world outside stayed gray. "Thank you," I said, running my fingers over the worn spine. It was a simple thing, a book. But it felt heavier, more deliberate, as though it carried more meaning than its pages suggested. He didn't leave immediately. He stayed by the gate, resting one hand on the post, his stance easy. The morning was bright, the kind of clear, sharp brightness that makes everything feel closer, louder. We talked about the garden at first, the plants that might survive the coming frost, the ones that wouldn't. But the conversation began to shift, almost without my noticing. He asked what kind of books I liked to read, and I found myself talking about novels I hadn't thought of in years. He mentioned the first house he'd owned, the one he'd rebuilt piece by piece, and how he'd once planted an entire row of lavender just because his wife had liked the smell. It wasn't the kind of conversation that should feel dangerous. But it did. At one point, he reached past me to point at a cracked beam on the porch. His hand hovered close enough that I could feel the warmth of it through the sleeve of my shirt. I stepped back, just slightly, but the closeness lingered anyway. Later that afternoon, we ended up near the shed again. The sun had shifted lower, casting long, uneven shadows across the yard. The air was still, and in that stillness, words seemed heavier, movements slower. He helped me lift a stubborn bag of soil, our hands brushing briefly on the edge of the sack. Neither of us pulled away fast enough to erase the moment. When we straightened, we stood facing each other, the space between us thinner than it should have been. And before I could stop it, we kissed. This time there was no stumbling excuse, no rain, no awkward slip of balance to blame. It happened because we let it. It wasn't long, but it wasn't as fleeting as the first. When we parted, there was a moment of silence that felt louder than any sound. I turned away first, focusing on the bag of soil, my breath uneven. He didn't say anything, just stood there for a beat longer before stepping back toward the gate. After he left, I stayed outside, staring at the book he'd given me, now resting on the porch rail. My fingers traced the worn edges, and I wondered what line had been crossed, or if it had been crossed long before, in smaller, subtler ways. That evening, my husband called again. He asked about the day, about the house, about the garden. I told him about the book, my voice steady, omitting the only part that mattered. After the call, I sat alone at the kitchen table. The room felt too big, the silence too heavy. I opened the book, flipping through its pages slowly, the paper soft and thin beneath my fingers. There were notes in the margins, faded pencil lines and underlined passages. It wasn't just a book, it was a piece of someone else's history, handed to me. I thought about the kiss, about the way it had felt different this time. Not accidental. Not impulsive. Chosen. And in the quiet of that night, I realized I couldn't tell myself it meant nothing anymore. Because it did. The days after that second kiss felt different, not louder or more dramatic, just heavier, as if every action carried weight it didn't before. Even the simplest things, opening curtains, making tea, sweeping the kitchen floor, seemed to hum with an awareness I couldn't turn off. I tried to stick to routines, hoping they would ground me, but routines only made the contrast sharper. In the morning, I folded laundry at the kitchen table while the kettle hissed on the stove. My hands moved automatically, stacking shirts, smoothing pillowcases, but my mind wasn't quiet. Every so often, I caught myself pausing, staring at nothing, remembering the way his fingers had brushed mine, the moment before that kiss when silence seemed to hold everything in place. When my husband called that day, I forced myself to sound normal. I asked about his meetings, nodded along to his stories about late dinners with colleagues, laughed in the right places. But behind every aha and that's good, my thoughts were elsewhere. That afternoon, I heard the sound of his truck outside, the neighbors. I felt it before I saw him, that shift in my chest, that split second of anticipation I tried to swallow down. I told myself I wouldn't go outside, that I had nothing to say, that avoiding him was the smartest choice. But when I glanced out the window, he was there by the fence, leaning lightly on the gate, a coil of rope over his shoulder. "Do you want me to take a look at that section of the garden bed?" he called out, his tone almost too casual, as though he'd practiced it. I should have said no. I knew that. But I didn't. Instead, I opened the door and stepped out, wiping my hands on my apron even though they weren't dirty. He walked through the gate, his boots leaving faint prints in the soft soil. We worked side by side for a while, pulling weeds, moving stones, clearing space where the earth had been choked for too long. The air was cooler that day, a light wind carrying the smell of cut grass and distant wood smoke. He talked about practical things, soil, drainage, where to put stakes for the tomatoes. I nodded, answered, let my hands stay busy. But underneath every exchange was a layer of something neither of us acknowledged. At one point, he bent to reach a rock embedded deep in the dirt. When he straightened, his hand brushed against mine again. Neither of us moved away quickly. Later, he mentioned there was a place nearby, a property that had been abandoned years ago. The house is falling apart, but there's an old shed there, he said, almost offhandedly. People leave things behind when they move. Sometimes you find tools, even furniture. The way he said it was casual, like an observation about the weather. But it landed differently. I nodded slowly, pretending to consider the practical side, old tools, furniture for the garden, anything that sounded ordinary. But a part of me felt the unspoken thing in his voice, the suggestion underneath the words. We didn't make plans right then. There was no date or time spoken aloud. But the thought of that place lingered like a spark. When he left, I watched him go, his shoulders relaxed, his stride steady. The gate clicked softly behind him, and the yard felt too quiet. That night, I sat on the edge of the bed after my husband's call, the house around me still. I thought about the abandoned house, about the way his eyes had flicked to mine when he mentioned it. I told myself it was nothing more than curiosity, that maybe I really did need extra tools, that maybe it was as simple as finding an old chair for the porch. But even as I thought those things, I knew the truth. This wasn't about tools. It wasn't about furniture. It was about the fact that I didn't tell him no. The morning we drove to the abandoned house, the sky was pale and still, the kind of gray that feels like it's holding its breath. I didn't tell anyone I was going, not that there was anyone to tell. My husband was still away, caught up in another cycle of flights and meetings, his voice reduced to quick phone calls and clipped reminders. He had no idea I was leaving the house that morning for anything other than groceries or errands. I met him by his truck, the neighbor, his tools already piled in the back, as though this was just another task, nothing unusual. He didn't say much when I walked up, just nodded once, the faintest shadow of a smile crossing his face before he turned the key in the ignition. The truck smelled faintly of earth and old leather. The road to the house wound through stretches of empty fields and narrow lanes lined with trees, their branches reaching across like fingers. Neither of us filled the quiet. I kept my eyes on the window, pretending to watch the scenery, though I wasn't really seeing anything. My reflection in the glass looked distant, almost like someone else's face, and that unsettled me more than I wanted to admit. When we arrived, the house stood back from the road, its roof sagging, windows clouded with dirt. Grass had grown tall around the porch, and the paint was peeling in strips. It didn't look like anyone had been there for years. "This is it," he said softly, more to himself than to me. We walked up the creaking steps. The door wasn't locked, it swung inward with a long, low groan. Inside, the air was cool, heavy with the smell of dust and would left too long without care. The floors were uneven, the walls marked with water stains and old nail holes. It felt like stepping into a paused life, everything left mid-breath. We moved through the rooms slowly, speaking little. In the kitchen, an old chair leaned against the counter, its legs uneven. In the hallway, a mirror hung crooked, its surface cloudy. Each object seemed to hum with stories I didn't want to hear too closely. When we reached the back room, we stopped. The light through the broken blinds cast long bars across the floor. There was nothing remarkable about the room, just a table, a cracked window, a few boxes stacked in the corner, but it felt different. He stepped closer, not in a rush, just narrowing the space between us. My breath came uneven, though I tried to steady it. We didn't talk about what we were doing there. We didn't talk about what we'd already crossed to get to this moment. We stood there for a moment, the silence louder than any sound could have been. And then, without hesitation, we spent the night together. The words are simple, but the truth beneath them wasn't. There was no script, no plan, no tidy explanation. Just hours that slipped by, filled with everything I'd been trying not to think about, everything I'd been holding back. When morning came, the house felt colder. Dust floated in the thin light coming through the window. I sat on the edge of the table for a moment, looking at the cracks in the wood, at the peeling paint on the walls. Reality crept in slowly, not with a scream but with a whisper. We didn't speak much as we left the house. He closed the door softly behind us, though there was no reason to. It wasn't as if anyone would come after us. The drive back was quiet, the kind of quiet that isn't peaceful. I stared at my hands in my lap, fingers twisted together, and wondered what I'd done, not just that night, but every step that had led to it. When we reached my house, he stopped the truck but didn't turn off the engine. He glanced at me, his expression unreadable, and then looked away again. I stepped out without saying much, my voice caught somewhere between wanting to explain and not knowing how. The house looked the same as when I'd left it, windows, walls, roof, all untouched. But I wasn't the same when I walked back through that door. And I knew, even before I closed it behind me, that nothing about this could be erased. The morning after, the house felt foreign to me, as though I'd stepped into a place that only looked like mine. I closed the door quietly behind me, even though there was no one inside to hear it, and leaned against it for a long moment, letting my breath settle. Everything looked the same, the shoes by the door, the stack of mail on the table, the half-empty mug of tea from yesterday. But none of it felt the same. I set my keys on the counter and stared at my own hands, noticing the dirt under my nails, the faint scrape on my wrist from brushing against an old beam in that abandoned house. My body carried traces of where I'd been, of what I'd done, and I couldn't wash them away as easily as I could wash soil off my fingers. The day unfolded in silence. I moved through the rooms like a guest in someone else's life, touching things lightly, as if they might break under my fingers. I folded laundry that didn't need folding, wiped down counters that were already clean, but every task was just an attempt to keep my thoughts at bay. When my phone rang in the afternoon, my husband's name lighting up the screen, my heart stuttered. His voice was calm, warm even, as he told me about the new flight schedule, about meetings wrapping up early, about how he might be home sooner than expected. I listened, nodded, murmured agreement, all while feeling my throat tighten. When we hung up, I stayed sitting at the table, staring at the phone like it might accuse me. It didn't, of course. It just lay there, silent and neutral, while my thoughts spun. I went outside to the garden later, hoping the fresh air would help. The sun was out, but the wind was cool, and the soil was still damp from last night's rain. I crouched by the hydrangeas, pretending to check their roots, though I wasn't really looking. He didn't come by that day. The neighbor. For the first time in what felt like weeks, I didn't see him in the yard, didn't hear the crunch of his boots on the gravel path. Part of me was relieved, grateful for the distance. Another part of me kept glancing at the fence, waiting for a shadow that never came. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed, the room dark, the ceiling faintly visible in the light from the street lamp outside. I thought about the abandoned house, about the hours there, about the silence in the truck on the way home. My mind replayed every moment, every choice, until it all blurred into one long, restless ache. The next morning, he came. I saw him through the kitchen window, standing by the gate with his hands in his pockets, his expression hard to read. I stepped outside, heart thudding too fast. We didn't talk about what had happened. Not directly. He asked if the fence needed another coat of sealant. I said maybe. He mentioned the soil near the back corner might need turning. I nodded. The words were simple, practical, but beneath them was something else, a current neither of us named. At one point, he handed me a pair of gloves I hadn't asked for. Our fingers brushed, and the contact was so slight it shouldn't have meant anything. But it did. When he left, he didn't linger. He just nodded once, the same way he always did, and walked back through the gate. I stood there for a long time after he was gone, staring at the gloves in my hand. They were a little too big for me, the leather soft and worn. The house was quiet when I went back inside. Too quiet. I sat at the table again, looking out at the yard, thinking about the space between what I felt and what I admitted to myself. Because what happened in that abandoned house wasn't something I could pretend away. It wasn't an accident. And it wasn't something I could undo. For the first time, I let that truth sit fully in my mind. And it felt heavier than anything I'd ever carried. The day my husband came home earlier than planned started like any other. I woke to sunlight creeping through the blinds, made coffee, and moved through the motions of the morning as if I had any control over how the day would unfold. There was no warning, no message saying he was on his way. It wasn't until I heard the car pull into the driveway, the familiar sound of the engine shutting off, that my heart lurched. I froze at the kitchen counter, the mug in my hand suddenly too heavy. A few seconds later, I heard the front door open, his footsteps crossing the threshold. He called my name, his voice light but with a question in it, as if he was testing the waters of his own arrival. I forced my voice steady, answering from the kitchen, and a moment later he was standing in the doorway, suitcase in hand, smiling the way people do when they expect happiness to be mirrored back at them. I hugged him, because that's what I should do. His jacket smelled faintly of the airport, of travel and stale coffee, and I held on to him a second too long, maybe to cover how stiff I felt. He asked about the house, about the garden, about the neighbors. Each question landed like a small stone in a still pond, ripples spreading wider than he could see. I answered easily at first. Yes, the garden was coming along. Yes, the neighbors were friendly. My voice was calm, even, but inside it felt like every syllable might betray me. At dinner, the tension began to creep in. I'd made pasta, poured 2 glasses of wine, tried to keep my hands steady as I set the table. He sat across from me, eating, talking about the trip, the meetings, the delayed flights. I nodded, smiled, played my part. Then he mentioned the neighbor, casually, offhandedly. That guy next door seems helpful. Fixed the latch, didn't he? My fork paused just above the plate. My heart gave a sharp, panicked thud before I forced a small laugh. Yes, I said, setting the fork down gently, he's been very kind. But even as I said it, I knew the smile on my face was too careful, the words too deliberate. He didn't notice, or if he did, he didn't say. He kept talking, and I kept nodding, but the conversation felt like a test I hadn't studied for. At one point, I reached for my glass too quickly and knocked it slightly. Red wine sloshed over the rim, dripping onto the tablecloth. My breath caught, and I muttered something about being clumsy, dabbing at the stain with a napkin. My hands shook just enough to give me away, to myself, if not to him. The rest of the meal passed in fragments, his voice filling the spaces while mine stayed quiet. Later, when we sat in the living room, he mentioned wanting to invite the neighbor over for dinner sometime, a friendly gesture, he said, since the man had been so helpful. The suggestion landed in my chest like a stone dropped in cold water. I forced another laugh, this one thinner. That could be nice, I said, though my pulse thudded in my ears. After he went to bed, I stayed up, sitting at the kitchen table long after the dishes were done. The house was silent except for the occasional creak of the settling walls. I stared at the tablecloth, at the faint wine stain I hadn't quite scrubbed out, and felt the weight of everything I hadn't said pressing down on me. The quiet felt dangerous that night, like it was holding its breath. Every sound, the hum of the fridge, the ticking of the clock, was a reminder of what I'd done, what I hadn't told, and the fragile thread holding it all together. Because one thing had become clear the moment he walked through the door: secrets don't just stay secrets forever. The morning he suggested we drive out to see that old place felt ordinary at first. The sun was just beginning to rise, painting the sky with pale streaks of gold, and for a moment I thought we'd have a quiet day, no surprises, no heavy words hanging in the air. My husband had his coffee in one hand and his keys in the other, standing in the doorway with that casual authority he always carried. "I heard there's an abandoned property not far from here," he said lightly, almost as if he'd been thinking about it for days. "Might be worth checking out. You mentioned needing furniture for the porch, didn't you?" The words landed with a weight they shouldn't have. My breath caught, but I masked it with a nod, forcing my voice steady. "Yes. That could be useful." We left not long after, the drive quiet except for the sound of gravel crunching under the tires. The air inside the car felt heavy, though neither of us spoke much. I stared out the window, my thoughts racing far faster than the car. The landscape blurred by fields, clusters of trees, the occasional mailbox standing lonely by the road. With each passing mile, I felt my pulse quicken, a creeping dread I couldn't name tightening in my chest. When we pulled into the overgrown driveway, my stomach sank. The house stood there just as it had before, weathered, broken in places, its paint peeling in long strips like loose skin. Only this time, the weight of every memory attached to it pressed down on me all at once. I stepped out of the car slowly, the ground soft beneath my shoes. My husband looked around, hands in his pockets, eyes scanning the exterior as if he were appraising it. "This place has character," he said, half to himself, half to me. I didn't answer. My throat felt dry, words lodged somewhere between thought and voice. We walked up the steps, the boards creaking under our combined weight. He pushed the door, and it swung open with the same groan it had before. Inside, the air was cool and still. Dust floated lazily in the light coming through the broken blinds. He moved through the rooms easily, glancing at walls, noting broken beams and sagging ceilings. I followed, each step heavier than the last, my heart hammering so loudly I thought he might hear it. And then, suddenly, he wasn't the only one there. I saw him, the neighbor, standing in the doorway of the back room, his expression caught between surprise and stillness. The world seemed to narrow to that moment, the three of us suspended in it. My husband stopped mid-step, his eyes locking on the neighbor, then shifting briefly to me. He didn't say a word, but the silence between them was sharper than anything he could have spoken. I felt my breath catch, my hands trembling at my sides. My mind scrambled for something, an explanation, an excuse, anything, but there was nothing that wouldn't crumble the moment it left my mouth. The neighbor didn't move at first. He just stood there, shoulders tense, eyes flicking between us. Then, almost imperceptibly, he stepped back, as if trying to shrink out of sight. But it was too late. The air in the room felt thick, heavy with all the unspoken truths pressing into it. My husband's face didn't twist into anger, didn't even harden. That might have been easier. Instead, his expression shifted in a way that made my stomach turn, a quiet, stunned clarity, like pieces falling into place. No one spoke. There weren't any accusations, no raised voices, no frantic explanations tumbling out to fill the space. Just silence, each second stretching long enough to hurt. I stood there, caught between the man I had promised my life to and the one who had been quietly, steadily pulling me away from it. In that moment, there was no hiding, no undoing, no pretending. The truth didn't need words. It was already in the room, hanging between us, undeniable. I don't remember who moved first, if it was my husband turning toward the door, or the neighbor stepping further back, or me standing frozen in the middle of it all. What I do remember is the stillness that came after, a silence that felt like the end of something, though I couldn't yet tell what kind of end it would be. We left the house not long after. The drive home was wordless, the car filled with the sound of tires on gravel and the weight of what couldn't be taken back. The house came into view again, our house, though it didn't feel like mine in that moment. When we walked through the door, the walls were the same, the furniture unmoved, the air still. But everything had shifted, all the same. And there, standing in that quiet kitchen, I understood with painful clarity, the secret was no longer mine to hold. It was out in the open now, and nothing would ever be the same again.